Hey guys, Jared here, and today we're going to check out the 1080 Ti Gaming X Trio graphics card from MSI. We'll find out how it performs in a number of game benchmarks at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, as well as find out how hot and loud it gets under full load, and finally decide if it's worth buying for the price. Inside the box, we've got the graphics card itself, a 6 to 8 pin power adapter, and a bracket for mounting the card inside the case. Let's take a quick look at the card itself, starting with the front. There's 3 fans featuring the MSI logo with a grey and red theme, and while running, the red parts light up with red LEDs. On the back, there's a full black backplate with the MSI logo as well as some ventilation holes. Along the top, there's 2 8-pin power connectors and the SLI connectors. There's also an RGB lighting strip, and the MSI letters also light up. More on this soon. On the rear of the card, we can see that it takes up 2.5 PCIe slots, and features 2 DisplayPort 1.4 ports, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, and a DVI-D port. Underneath and towards the end of the card, we can see just how large the heatsink is, and we'll see how well it keeps things cool in the benchmarks. The dimensions of the card are 325mm by 140mm by 48mm, and it weighs just under 1.5 kilos, so it's fairly beefy. My motherboard has a reinforced PCIe slot, and even with the card screwed in tightly, it still droops down a little. MSI do include a bracket to help hold it in place, however I only found this made a small difference and still didn't keep it fully straight, so I didn't use it for very long. The lighting can be adjusted through MSI's Mystic LightSync software. This lets us change the effects of the red lights on the front or turn them off completely. Unfortunately, you can't change the color of these. However, I didn't really even notice them with the card installed facing down in my case anyway. Color matching may be more of an issue if you mount your card some other way. There are more options available for the lighting bar on the top of the card. You can customly set individual colors, change the brightness, and there are a few different lighting effects ready to use, which you can also adjust the speed of. As for the specs, like other 1080 Ti's, the card has 3584 CUDA cores, an 11GHz memory clock with 11GB of GDDR5X memory. And here are the clock speeds that can be set through the MSI gaming app. I've performed all my testing with the default gaming mode option, and while manually overclocking with MSI Afterburner, the card averaged a 2GHz core clock. This wasn't very much higher than what it was boosting to anyway, and I didn't find it to make enough practical difference to justify redoing all of the benchmarks again, as the results were within margin of error ranges. It was already performing really good straight out of the box. MSI recommend a 600-watt power supply and advise the card will draw around 250 watts. The system that I'm testing in has an Intel 8700K overclocked to 5.1 GHz. I'm using the best CPU that I can for gaming in order to reduce it being a limiting factor in the benchmarks. The system also has 16GB of DDR4 memory running at 2666 MHz, and is running Windows 10 with all updates to date applied, along with Nvidia's 388.43 drivers. With all that in mind, let's take a look at the benchmark results. First, let's start with PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Keep in mind that this game is difficult to benchmark and the frame rate can vary based on what's going on in the game. This game maxes out at 144 FPS, which we're seeing at the low and very low settings. Even at Ultra, you'd probably still be happily running this card on a 120Hz panel. At 1440p, the results at the lower setting levels are fairly similar. High and Ultra settings take the largest hit here, but we're still getting pretty nice results for this game. 4K is where things start to go downhill for PUBG. This can be a resource-intensive game, even for the 8700K and 1080 Ti combo. Although, to be fair, while actually playing, I didn't notice any problems. The 1% lows aren't too far behind the averages here. Shadow of War at 1080p averages 120 FPS at ultra settings, so if you're using a high refresh rate panel, the 1080 Ti can deliver the frames required at this resolution. At 1440p we take a little step back, but the results are still pretty impressive. You could still get close to the 120 FPS mark at high settings if you want, otherwise the game still felt nice and smooth on ultra settings at 90 FPS. At 4K, on the higher settings, things go back quite a bit further. If you're looking for at least 60 FPS, you'll probably need to stick to high settings or below, which probably isn't an issue. The game still looks great on high at 4K. In The Witcher 3 at 1080p, we're again seeing the 1080 Ti being capable of pushing near 120 FPS at maximum settings, giving us no real reason to run on any lower settings. At 1440p, we need to drop down to high settings if we want to maintain the 120 FPS frame rate, while at 4K on ultra settings, we're hovering around 60 FPS, which is great as many 4K displays today don't support higher than this anyway. So again, in most cases, there's no real reasons to not run on max settings at 4K with the 1080 Ti. Really impressive. As for Watch Dogs 2 at 1080p, I was impressed with the results. I mostly benchmarked this game on laptops and it's fairly resource intensive, so I was surprised to see above 90 FPS at max settings here. Even at 1440p, we're still getting above 60 FPS, which for this game I think is plenty. Sure, it won't be incredibly smooth if you've got a high refresh rate display, and you can always drop the settings down a bit for that if you want. At 4K, it still felt acceptable at max settings, which I found surprising, but you'll want to drop down to high or lower if that 60 FPS number is important to you. In Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, we're seeing really high frame rates at max settings under DirectX 11. Usually we see higher frame rates with DirectX 12 here, but unfortunately I didn't have enough time to fully test. Even at 1440p, the 1080 Ti is smashing out over 120 FPS at max settings. This thing is a serious beast. At 4K, we're once again above the 60 FPS at max settings, which is awesome to see. Ghost Recon is another of those intensive games. We can see this in the Ultra 1080p result, which is the lowest out of all games tested. However, it still ran pretty good. Above 60 FPS even in the 1% lows. At 1440p, the average on Ultra is still just hanging in at 60 FPS. And again, you can get a fairly big jump even going back just one setting level if you're after higher frame rates. At 4K, you'll want to run at around high to get that 60 FPS average. Even the 1080 Ti is struggling at max settings here. As mentioned, this game just eats up all resources. In Doom at 1080p, we started hitting the 200 FPS cap a few times at the lower setting levels. Either way, you're getting really high FPS at any level of settings. It's a similar story at 1440p, even the 1% lows at max settings are above 120 FPS, so you'll always be getting a nice smooth experience. Even 4K isn't doing too bad. We're above 60 FPS for the 1% lows at max settings, so you can pretty much play maxed out on a 4K 60Hz panel no problems. Ashes of the Singularity is another one of those games that needs all the resources it can get. At 1080p, we're getting really good results for this game, while at 1440p this drops back a little, but again, we're still getting nice performance here. I was surprised when the 4K tests came back above 60 FPS on average. I've not personally seen that before in this game, so that was pretty impressive. So we can see the card is performing very nicely, but how hot is it getting while in use? With an ambient room temperature of 22 degrees Celsius, it was idling at 37 degrees Celsius, and while under full load it never passed 68 degrees Celsius, which I found pretty impressive for such a powerful card, especially considering that the fans didn't get very loud either. MSI say that the fans don't even need to start spinning until it hits 60 degrees Celsius, and in my own testing they didn't even start up until 63 degrees Celsius, which is pretty crazy. Here's what the backplate looked like at idle using a thermal camera. We can see that it warms up quite a bit and gets fairly hot to the touch under full load. At idle, so when the fans of the card aren't even moving, the entire system volume was around 45 decibels, and here's what that sounded like. While under full load, it rose around half a decibel or so, and here's what that sounded like. There's hardly any difference between idle and 100% GPU utilization after over half an hour of testing. To put that in perspective, if I manually max out the fans on the graphics card, it increased to 53 decibels, which was a bit more noticeable and sounded like this. With the fans manually maxed out, the temps never passed 52 degrees Celsius at full load, so you can go cooler if you don't mind the increased noise. It's important to note that I have a fair few other fans in the system, so these results are only useful for comparing against each other here. Additionally, the temperatures and therefore sounds will increase depending on the temperature of the room it's being run in. We've just entered summer here, so I'm pretty happy with these results. For around 1,349 Australian dollars here in Australia at the time of recording, or $819 US internationally, this card isn't cheap. However, it's also not the most expensive 1080 Ti available. I haven't yet been able to personally test any other 1080 Ti's to compare it with, but from what I've seen, you're paying a bit extra here to get the quieter and cooler running card. Overall, I think the Trio performs very well, and for the price you'd expect that. The Trio was able to run plenty of modern games at 4K 60 FPS with max settings, and while not for everyone, and possibly even overkill depending on your situation, you'd be looking at something like this for 4K 60Hz gaming, or even 1440p or 1080p 144Hz or 120Hz. So if you can afford it and you want a no compromises gaming experience, MSI's 1080 Ti Gaming X Trio looks like a solid choice. So what did you guys think of the Gaming X Trio graphics card? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and leave a like on the video if you found the information useful. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for future tech videos like this one.